Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty interesting today. President Trump's speech at Davos,
Oh, yeah. This one?
just a few days ago. It's not your typical political speech.
Definitely not.
He makes some pretty bold statements, and there are even a few surprises in there. So we're going to break down the key themes, analyze the tone, and really try to understand the message he's sending to the world.
It's interesting because even though it's on an international stage, it feels very domestic.
Right.
It's like he took a little piece of American politics with him over to the Swiss Alps.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into it. Right out of the gate, Trump declares a new golden age for America. And he claims it started the second he was elected. Again, no time for modesty there.
He's not really known for that, is he?
No, definitely not.
It's very interesting. He's drawing this direct line between his victory and a bright, booming future for the country. He even mentions securing all 7 swing states. This whole golden age thing, that language, echoes back to his previous terms, you know?
Right.
A lot of emphasis on American exceptionalism. It's also interesting, just as a side note, that the phrase itself has been used for a very long time. It often evokes some sort of, I don't know, mythical past, or even a super idealized future. Think about things like, you know, the golden age of Hollywood.
Oh, right.
Or even, going way back, the golden age of Athens. It's a very powerful tool to use in speeches. You know, it makes people feel optimistic and proud of their country.
Well, he's certainly not letting that tool gather dust.
Nope.
And he doesn't stop there. He immediately goes into this whirlwind of actions taken during his first few days back in office. We've got executive orders, budget freezes, and wait for it, a brand new Department of Government Efficiency. Hold on.
Whoa. Did I miss something? Was that in the campaign promises? I don't remember that.
I don't recall that specifically, but he's always been known to act fast.
That's true.
Sometimes even going around those traditional ways of making laws, you know.
Remember the national emergencies from his earlier terms?
Oh, yeah. Several of them.
Yeah, exactly. So this rapid-fire style, it could be him trying to show everyone that he's in control. You know, decisive, especially after being out of the White House for 4 years. The new department, though, that is interesting.
Very interesting.
It sounds like he really wants to make the government work better.
But
we'll have to see what that actually looks like, what it means in reality.
Okay, so lots of big promises, big moves. But what about the details? He spent some time talking about ending the Green New Deal, calls it a complete scam, actually, and pulls the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord again. This time, he criticizes the insane and costly electric vehicle mandate. Strong words.
It is strong, especially considering how much work went into the Paris Agreement. Almost 200 countries negotiated that, remember?
Right.
So by pulling out and going after things like the Green New Deal, he's definitely signaling some very different priorities, at least when it comes to energy and the environment.
Yeah.
I mean, this is going to upset a lot of people. Environmental groups, for sure. And all those countries committed to cutting greenhouse gas emissions.
He's drawing a line in the sand, it seems. And speaking of lines in the sand, let's talk economy. Trump goes all in on tax cuts.
Okay.
He promises relief for businesses and workers, particularly the ones, and I quote, who make their product in America.
Pure America First philosophy right there,
Yeah.
even down to the words he uses. It's all about American jobs and American businesses, and he's fine with using tariffs to protect those domestic industries.
So produce in America or pay the price?
Basically, a tariff is like a tax on stuff brought in from other countries.
Okay.
It makes those foreign products more expensive compared to the stuff made in America. The idea is to get people to buy American show,
Right.
but it can also make prices go up and lead to trade wars.
Right. Makes sense. He actually name-drops some companies, like SoftBank and Oracle. He says they're making huge investments in the U.S. because of his policies. Is he implying that he's the reason they made those decisions?
It is a bold statement.
Yeah.
I mean, companies make investment decisions based on so many things. It's complicated. Market conditions, regulations, all sorts of things. Trump's policies might be part of it, but it's not likely that they're the only reason. We should be careful about assuming that, you know, just because he says so.
Good point. Now, this is a big one. Immigration. He doesn't hold back at all.
Uh-oh.
He calls the situation at the southern border an invasion.
Oh.
And he declares another national emergency. Even for him, that's strong language.
this is where things get a little tricky, constitutionally speaking.
Yeah.
A national emergency declaration gives the president a lot of power. He can move money around and bypass Congress. Those powers are usually reserved for times of war or a real serious national crisis.
Right.
It's been a point of contention, throughout his career. Lots of critics say he uses this power too much. This particular declaration, it'll probably face some legal challenges, and it'll definitely spark those debates again about, the balance of power between the different parts of the government.
So we've got a golden age, a whole bunch of executive actions, and a national emergency declaration, all in just the first few days. What else is he planning?
Well, he goes on about cutting back regulations a lot. He calls for the, and I quote, largest deregulation campaign in history, his goal, you ask, to get rid of 10 old regulations for every new one they put in place.
He really paints a picture, He claims that under the Biden administration, the average American household had to deal with like an extra $50,000 in costs because of all those regulations. That's a big chunk of change. But is it even true? And even if it is, is getting rid of regulations always the right thing to do?
That's where it gets complicated. Sure, less regulation can sometimes boost the economy, at least in the short term. But there can be, unintended consequences.
Right.
Like what happened back in 2008 with the financial crisis. That was partly because of not enough regulation in the banking industry.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It's a balancing act, How do you encourage new ideas and businesses while also protecting people, workers, and the environment?
It sounds like a constant back and forth, trying to make the economy strong, but also making sure things are fair and safe. But let's move on from the big picture stuff and get into some specifics. Trump takes questions from the audience at Davos, and some of those exchanges are pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Like his back and forth with Steve Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone. Schwarzman brings up how frustrated European businesses are with all the EU regulations. And Trump, while he jumps right on that, criticizes all the EU bureaucracy and what he sees as unfair treatment of the U.S. in trade deals.
He even tells a story, a personal one, about this project he had in Ireland. He says he got approval in a week, but then was told it would take 5 or 6 years to get approval from the EU. Classic Trump.
Yeah. Always using a story to prove a point. It's smart, though. Makes this complicated topic of international regulations easier to understand, even entertaining.
Sure.
But, as always, you got to be careful about taking stories like that at face value.
Yeah.
Is this actually how things usually go, or is it just a carefully chosen example to make his point stronger?
Good question. He goes on to complain about the EU's VAT taxes, tariffs, and how they treat American tech companies, like Apple and Google. Sounds familiar. Same song, different verse.
Yeah.
This was a constant source of frustration for him in his previous terms.
Right. He really sees those trade practices as unfair.
Definitely. He's very vocal about it.
He's not afraid to call out specific countries, even Canada, for what he sees as bad behavior. He even jokes about Canada just becoming a U.S. state.
Whoa.
Saying, that closer economic ties would be good for everyone.
Yeah.
He's got that mix of humor and harsh criticism that makes him so interesting and so polarizing, too.
It gets people's attention, for sure. That's clear in his conversation with Patrick Pouyanné, the CEO of Total Energies. Pouyanné asks him about his stance on LNG exports from the U.S., specifically whether he's worried about how it'll affect gas prices here at home.
Right.
This gives Trump the perfect chance to talk about energy dominance, America's vast resources of oil and gas, and how committed he is to making the U.S. a manufacturing superpower.
It's a complete rejection of the global shift towards, renewable energy. He's doubling down on fossil fuels.
He's all about fast-tracking approvals for those LNG plants in Louisiana and slashing regulations, of course, to really boost production here in the U.S. It's interesting. He basically wants American energy to power the entire world.
It's a bold idea, no doubt, but it also brings up questions about, what his policies mean for the environment.
Right.
Is he willing to put energy independence and economic growth above dealing with climate change? Seems that way.
Next up, we hear from Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America. Moynihan points out how quickly Trump's been acting in his first week and asks how he's going to balance all these actions with his goals of economic growth, keeping prices stable, and, a strong stock market.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's what everyone wants to know.
Yeah.
Trump responds by going back to tax cuts, especially for companies that manufacture in the U.S. He says these cuts will get people investing, create jobs, and eventually get inflation under control.
Sounds familiar.
It's classic supply-side economics. We've heard it from him before. But then he kind of shifts gears, starts accusing banks including Bank of America, of being unfair to conservative businesses.
Whoa, that's a curveball.
It's unexpected, especially on a stage like Davos.
It shows you that Trump never forgets his base.
Right.
Even when he's talking to an international audience, he knows this will resonate with some conservatives who feel like they're being targeted by, big institutions. It's a powerful political strategy, even if, there's no proof to back up the claims.
He's definitely playing on that us versus them feeling, even in the world of finance. And this theme continues in his talk with Ana Botín, the executive chairman of Banco Santander. She asks about his plans for deregulation and how fast he'll make those changes.
Got it.
This gives Trump another chance to attack the Green New Deal, calls it a total disgrace and a waste of money. He claims his previous administration achieved the cleanest air and cleanest water while also having the most productive economy in U.S. history.
That's a bold statement. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree.
Definitely. Environmental groups will have something to say about that.
Yeah. And anyone who believes those environmental regulations are important for public health.
It's like he's making it a choice, economic prosperity or protecting the environment.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Exactly.
There are ways to have both.
For sure. And it's something we see throughout the whole speech, the idea that you can't have a strong economy and also protect the environment. But that's not necessarily true. There are lots of examples of policies that do both.
Right. He ends this part by going back to how committed he is to demanding respect from other nations, especially when it comes to trade. He goes off about trade deficits, especially with Canada and Mexico, and he hints that he's ready to use tariffs to make things fair.
That America First message is back, loud and clear. And he's not afraid to get aggressive to protect American interests. It's more of what we saw in his previous terms, and it could cause some tension with important allies and partners.
Okay, we've gone over a lot here, from golden ages to national emergencies, from cutting back regulations to trade wars. Let's zoom out for a second. Look at the big picture, the global situation. Trump spends quite a bit of time in this speech talking about America's relationship with other countries. And it's pretty interesting how he talks about those interactions.
Yeah, it's a very, personal approach to diplomacy. He talks about leaders he really admires, like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, really emphasizing those personal connections and shared values. And then there are the ones he clearly sees as opponents, especially the EU.
And then there's his take on the war in Ukraine, which is, still going on.
Right.
He talks about wanting peace, but then suggests that the number of deaths we're hearing about isn't really accurate, that it's much lower than the reality. It's a pretty big shift in tone.
It is a little jarring. And, downplaying the human cost of war like that is concerning. It makes you question whether he really understands the conflict and, has empathy for the victim.
It's also a stark contrast to what I said earlier about strength and being decisive. It almost feels like he's trying to have it both ways, talking about peace, but also downplaying how serious things are.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this comment about wanting to meet with Putin to, negotiate an end to the war. He seems to believe that he's the only one who can really connect with Putin on a personal level and work out a deal.
It's that same idea that he can solve these huge, complicated global problems just by using his personality and, deal-making skills. We see this over and over in his approach to foreign policy.
It can be a dangerous strategy. International relations are rarely that straightforward. There are historical tensions, competing interests, complex power dynamics. Thinking that you can just smooth everything over through personal relationships is naive and potentially dangerous.
He seems to be oversimplifying things. Like if he can just get in a room with the right people, he can negotiate anything. But the world doesn't really work that way.
Exactly. And this brings us to what he says about the relationship between the U.S. and China. He talks about wanting a fair relationship with China, acknowledging the economic competition and all tension from trade imbalances and, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's a tough situation. He wants to show strength and stand up to China on trade and national security. But he also needs them to work together on global problems like climate change and nuclear weapons.
It's one of the most important relationships in the world, and it's definitely complicated. There are areas where they could work together and areas where they're just going to clash. Finding that right balance, that's going to be really important for both countries and for the whole world.
It's a high-stakes game, and it's playing out on a global stage. And then, this is interesting, he says he hopes China can help stop the war in Ukraine. That's not really his usual America First talk.
It's definitely a more practical approach. He's recognizing that China's influence is growing and they're needed to solve global problems. It suggests that even with his focus on American strength, he's willing to work with other countries sometimes.
So we've got these bold statements, personal appeals, and some surprisingly practical moments. A lot to think about. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways? What's this speech really telling us about Trump's vision for America and its place in the world?
It's a vision that's very focused on American exceptionalism, on economic nationalism, and a return to a more aggressive foreign policy. He's all about strength, decisiveness, and changing the way things are, both in America and on the world stage.
But there are also signs of, oversimplifying things, relying too much on personal relationships instead of strategy, and a tendency to ignore inconvenient truths. It's a vision that's both attractive and worrying. It offers a glimpse into a future that could be good, but also potentially risky.
And that's what makes this speech so interesting. It brings up more questions than it answers, and it makes us really think about the decisions facing America and the world.
Well, that was a wild ride. We dove deep into Trump's Davos speech, explored the main themes, how he uses language to persuade, and what it all means about his worldview.
We looked at the contradictions, the bold claims, and the things that caught us off guard, and we tried to connect everything to see what this speech says about him, this particular time in history, and what might be coming next.
But the conversation isn't over. We want to know what you think. What stood out to you? What surprised you? What are you still thinking about?
Go to the comments and share your thoughts. Let's keep talking about it.
And if you want more deep dives into the worlds of politics, history, culture, and everything in between, hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more to explore. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.